The Book of Ezra, Chapter 2. Here is a list of the people of the province who had been exiled, carried off to Babel by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, but who later returned from exile and went up to Yerushalayim and Yehudah, each to his own city. They went with Zerubbabel, Yeshua, Nechemyah, Sariah, Realiah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rechem, and Banah. The number of men from the people of Israel. Descendants of Parash, 2,172. Descendants of Shephatiah, 372. Descendants of Arach, 775. Descendants of Pahat Moav, from the descendants of Yeshua and Joab, 2,812. Descendants of Elam, 1,254. Descendants of Zatu, 945. Descendants of Zakai, 760. Descendants of Bani, 642. Descendants of Bavai, 623. Descendants of Azgad, 1,222. Descendants of Adonikam, 666. Descendants of Bigvai, 2,056. Descendants of Aden, 454. Descendants of Atur, of Yechizkiah, 98. Descendants of Betzai, 323. Descendants of Yorah, 112. Descendants of Hashum, 223. Descendants of Gebar, 95. Descendants of Bet Lechem, 123. People of Netophah, 56. The people of Anatot, 128. Descendants of Azmavet, 42. Descendants of Kiryat Aram, Kephirah, and Beirut, 743. Descendants of Ramah and Geba, 621. People of Michmas, 122. People of Bet El and Ai, 223. Descendants of Nevo, 52. Descendants of Magbish, 156. Descendants of other Elam, 1,254. Descendants of Haram, 320. Descendants of Lod, Hadid, and Ono, 725. Descendants of Jericho, 345. Descendants of Saniah, 363. 3,630. The cohanim. The descendants of Yediah, of the house of Yeshua, 973. Descendants of Immer, 1,052. Descendants of Pashkur, 1,247. Descendants of Harim, 1,017. The Leviim, descendants of Yeshua and Kadmiel, 74. The singers, descendants of Asaph, 128. The descendants of the gatekeepers, descendants of Shallum, descendants of Ater, descendants of Talmon, descendants of Akuv, descendants of Hatita, and descendants of Shovai, in all, 139. The temple servants, descendants of Zikah, descendants of Hasupha, descendants of Tabaot, descendants of Kiros, descendants of Seiah, descendants of Padon, descendants of Levana, descendants of Hagavah, descendants of Ekuv, descendants of Hagav, descendants of Salmai, descendants of Hanan, descendants of Gidel, descendants of Gachar, descendants of Reaiah, descendants of Retzin, descendants of Nekoda, descendants of Gazam, descendants of Uzzah, descendants of Pasich, descendants of Besai, descendants of Asna, descendants of Meunim, descendants of Nephusim, descendants of Bakbuk, descendants of Hakufa, descendants of Harhur, descendants of Batzlut, descendants of Makeda, descendants of Harsha, descendants of Barkos, descendants of Sisra, descendants of Timach, descendants of Nitziach, and descendants of Hatipha. The descendants of Shlomo's servants, descendants of Sotai, descendants of Hesopheret, descendants of Peruda, descendants of Yaela, descendants of Darkon, descendants of Giddel, descendants of Shephatiah, descendants of Hatil, descendants of Pocheret Hatzaim, and descendants of Amy. All the temple servants and the descendants of Shlomo's servants numbered 392. The following went up from Tel Melach, Tel Harsha, Karuv, Aden, and Immer, but they could not state which father's clan they or their children belonged to, so it was not clear whether they were from Israel. Descendants of Deliah, descendants of Toviah, and descendants of Nekoda, 652. And of the descendants of the cohanim, descendants of Haviah, descendants of Hakutz, and descendants of Barzillai, who took a wife from the daughters of Barzillai the Giladi, and was named after them. These tried to locate their genealogical records, but they weren't found. Therefore, they were considered defiled and were not allowed to serve as cohanim. The Tirshata told them not to eat any of the especially holy food until a Kohen appeared who could consult the Urim and Thummim. The entire assembly numbered 42,360, not including their male and female slaves, of whom there were 7,337. They also had 200 male and female singers. Their horses numbered 736, their mules 245, their camels 435, and their donkeys 6,720. Some of the heads of the fathers' clans, when they came to the house of Adonai in Yerushalayim, made voluntary offerings for rebuilding the house of God on its site. According to their means, they gave into the treasury for the work 61,000 gold dakmanim, about 2/3 of a ton, 5,000 manim of silver, just over 3 tons, and 100 tunics for the Kohanim. So the Kohanim, Leviim, some of the people, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants lived in their towns, and all Israel in their towns.